So I am very hopeful that, and so I mean, I'm a radical empiricist, which I'm very strong with that. Like that's what, you know, so, science isn't about ultimately being a materialist. It's like, it's about being an empiricist in my view. And so, for example, I'm very fascinated by the so-called psi phenomenon, like stuff that people just kind of reject out of hand. I kind of orient towards that stuff with an idea of, hey, look, what we consider like anything exists as natural. And so, but the boundary of what we observe in nature, like what we recognize as in nature moves, like what we do today and what we know today would only be described as magic 500 years ago or even 100 years ago, some of it. So there will surely be things that, like you explain these phenomena that just sound like completely they're supernatural now, where there may be, for some of it, like some of it might turn out to be a complete bunk and some of it might turn out to be, it's just another layer of nature, whether we're talking about multiple dimensions that are invoked or something we don't even have the language toward. And what you're saying about the moving together of the model and the real thing of conscious, like I'm very sympathetic to that. So that's that part of like on the armchair side where I want to be clear, I can't say this as a scientist, but just in terms of speculating, I find myself attracted to these more of the sort of the panpsychism ideas, and that kind of makes sense to me. I don't know if that's what you meant there, but it seemed like related, the sense that ultimately, if you were completely modeling, like it's like if you completely modeling, unless you dismiss like the idea that there is a phenomenal consciousness, which I think is hard, given that I seem like I have one. That's really all I know, but that's so compelling, I can't just dismiss that. Like if you take that as a given, then the only way for the model and the real thing to merge is if there is something baked into the nature of reality, sort of like in the history of like there's certain just like fundamental forces or fundamental like, and that's been useful for us. And sometimes we find out that that's pointing towards something else, or sometimes it's still seems like it's a fundamental, and sometimes it's a placeholder for someone to figure out. But there's something like this is just a given, this is just, and sometimes something like gravity seems like a very good placeholder, and then there's something better that comes to replace it. Right. So I kind of think about like consciousness, and I kind of had this inclination before I knew there was a term for it, Russellian monism, the idea that, which is a form of again, I'm an armchair philosopher, but not a very good one.
Broadly, panpsychism, by the way, is the idea that sort of consciousness permeates all matter, it's a fundamental part of physics of the universe, kind of thing. So there's a lot of different flavors of it, as you're alluding to.
And something that struck me as like consistent with some just inclinations of mine, just total speculation, is this idea of everything we know in science and with most of the stuff we think of physics, really describes, it's all interactions. Mm-hmm. It's not the thing itself. Like there is something to and this sounds very new agey, which is why it's very difficult, and I have a high bullshit like meter and everything, but like an isness. I mean, think about like Aldous Huxley with his mescaline experience and Doors of Perception. Like there's an isness there, and Alan Watson. Like there is a nature of being. Again, very new agey sounding, but maybe there is something to. And when we say consciousness, we think of like this human experience, but maybe that's so processed and so that's so far. So it's so derivative of this kind of basic thing that we wouldn't even recognize the basic thing. But the basic thing might just be, this is not about the interaction between particles. This is what it is like to exist as a particle. And maybe it's not even particles. Maybe it's like space-time itself. I mean, again, totally in the speculation
and something outside of space-time. So it's funny because we don't have neither the science nor the proper language to talk about it. All we have is kind of little intuitions about there might be something in that direction of the darkness to pursue. And that in that sense, I find panpsychism interesting in that, like, it does feel like there's something fundamental here. That consciousness is not just like, okay, so the flip side, consciousness could be just a very basic and trivial symptom, like a little hack of nature that's useful for like survival of an organism. It's not something fundamental. It's just this very basic, boring chemical thing that somehow has convinced us humans, because we're very human centric, we're very self centric, that this is somehow really important. But it's actually pretty obvious. But or it could be something really fundamental to the nature of the universe. So both of those are, to me, pretty compelling, and I think eventually scientifically testable. It is so frustrating that it's hard to design a scientific experiment currently, but I think that's how Nobel Prizes are won. Is nobody did it until they do it. So
and the reason I lean towards, and again, armchair if I had to bet, like $1,000 on which one of these ultimately be proved, I would lean towards. I'd put my bets on something like panpsychism rather than the emergence of phenomenal consciousness through complexity or computational complexity, because although certainly if there is some underlying fundamental consciousness, it's clearly being processed in this way through computation, in terms of resulting in our experience and the experience presumably of other animals. But the reason I would bet on panpsychism is, to me, Occam's razor. It just, in terms of truly the hard problem, like this, at some point you have an inside looking out, and even looking refers to vision, and it doesn't. That's just an example, but just there's an inside experiencing something. At some point of complexity, all of a sudden, you start from this objective universe, and all we know about is interactions between things, and things happen. And at this certain level of complexity, magically there's an inside. That to me doesn't pass Occam's razor as easily as maybe there is a fundamental property of the universe of, there's both subjective and objective. There is both interactions amongst things, and there is the thing itself.
Yes.
But
yeah. So I'm of two minds. I agree with you totally on half my mind. And the other half is I've seen, looking at cellular automata a lot, which is it sure does seem that we don't understand anything about complexity, like the emergence, just the property. In fact, that could be a fundamental property of reality, is something within the emergence from simple things interacting, somehow miraculous things happen. And like that, I don't understand that. That could be fundamental. That like something about the layers of abstraction, like layers of reality, like really small things interacting, and then on another layer emerges actual complicated behavior, even though the underlying thing is super simple. Like that process we don't understand either, and that could be bigger than any of the things we're talking about. That's the basic force behind everything that's happening in the universe, is from simple things complex phenomena can happen.
And the thing that gives me pause is that I'm concerned about a threshold there. Like, how is it likely that now there may be some qualitative shift that in the realm of like we don't even understand complexity yet, like you're saying, like, so maybe there is, but I do think like if it is a result of the complexity, well, just having helium versus hydrogen is a form of complexity. Having the existence of stars versus clouds of gas is a complexity. The entire universe has been this increasing complexity. And so that kind of brings me back to then the other of like, okay, if it's about complexity, then it exists at a certain level in these simple systems like a star or a
they all have
more complex atom.
The panpsychism, that's right. But we humans, the qualitative shift, we might have evolved to appreciate certain kinds of thresholds.
Right.
Yeah.
I do think it's likely that this idea that whether or not there's an inner experience, which is phenomenal, it's the hard problem, that acting like an agent, like having an algorithm that basically like operates as if there is an agent, that's clearly a thing that I think has worked. And that there is a whole lot to figure out there and I think psychedelics will be extremely helpful in figuring more out about that, because they do seem to a lot of times eliminate that or whatever, radically shift that sense of self.